Lorna Humphrey, a mother, an artist, and so much more. Her first child Lee was born deaf and went undiagnosed until 22 months. Through her artwork, she interprets the defining events in her life while raising him.
I've always been involved in art and design, both in my career and my personal life, and my ambition when I was at art college was to be an art therapist. However, I gave up my career because I discovered I had a deaf son. He wasn't actually diagnosed until he was 22 months, and later on I discovered my daughter had a unilateral hearing loss, and that wasn't diagnosed until she was 4 years. This was, in my mind, mostly due to egotism in the health service and failing to listen to the clues that me as a parent were giving the staff. When Lee was finally diagnosed at 22 months as profoundly deaf, he was fitted with a phonic hearing aid, which was basically a big box fitted to his chest, a big ugly thing, which led up to ear modes to amplify the sound. He got more or less nothing from it. And I was very enthusiastic actually at the time when I found out he was deaf, and I said, oh, should I learn to sign? And the supporting staff, the teacher of deaf, said to me, no, if you sign, he will never speak. And from there, it was advocated that it was oralism only that I use, which is hearing and speaking only with Lee, that I don't use any signs whatsoever, which is what I did until he was 3 years old. By the time he was 3, he had 6 animal sounds. That was it. That was a sum total. He couldn't communicate with me, and I could hardly communicate with him. During that time, he was just moving away from me every time I went near him, and I felt as though he was a bubble, and the inertia of my movement moving near to him, he just floated off into the distance. At that time, it just felt my life was in a vortex, and he was the centre of it, trapped in this bubble. And so I created this painting called Lost in a Bubble to help put this huge negative, stressful time into something positive. By the time Lee was 3.5 years old, and with his 6 animal sounds, I aired my concerns to who I now refer to as the professionals, because we're talking about speech therapists, audiologists, teachers of the deaf, everybody's involved. Basically, they take over your life. And I said I wanted to learn sign language, and I wanted to teach these sign language because I was concerned that communication was being sacrificed in the name of speech, and it was important for him to be able to communicate, and also for me to communicate to him. And there was no speech. So they said, okay, we'll come out and we'll visit and we'll assess Lee and we'll discuss it further. So about 3 or 4 professionals came out to my house and they videoed me playing with Lee. However, they showed the video to me on my TV, and they pointed out all my mistakes and all my failings, and basically blamed his lack of progress on me and my inability to get him to speak. I was completely in shock. I was just recovering from a miscarriage 2 months prior. I was so upset that basically I asked them all to leave. So I created a sculpture called The Professionals. And basically I made them as exotic orchids with these beautiful heads, proud and regal, but heavy. But if you took each one separately, they would collapse with the weight of their bloom, which was their ego. But crowded together, they were a strength. And they overshadowed this little weed growing out the earth, which was me, the parent. Because no matter what, you're going to get weeds growing everywhere. And even they were trying to overshadow me with their positions. So that's why I created this sculpture called The Professionals. I was in such a state that I contacted social services because I was concerned I wasn't a good enough mother. I wanted to run away, but I couldn't escape because who was going to look after him? So anyway, the social service came out, and this lady called Grace came and she spoke to me. And I still think of her as Saving Grace, because it was a film I think called Saving Grace. Anyway, she was a wonderful help. And after assessing me, she very kindly said to me, Lorna, she says, in actual fact, the professionals have de-skilled you as a parent. And this was a bit of a relief that I really did have the skill to be a good parent. But with all the intervention and the criticism and the blaming me for my son's lack of progress was actually destroying me and destroying my relationship with my son. So what she advised to do was to take a step back and that I don't see the professionals for 3 months and get a break from them. So that's what I did. And that was the most empowering 3 months of my life. I did the next painting, which was called Into the Light, because at last I realised I wasn't to blame and my son wasn't to blame. It was a methodology that was used at the time of forcing children a round peg into a square hole. So that was how I came about painting this painting, Into the Light. Around the same time, I had seen other children getting a cochlear implant, and I'd seen the difference in them and their speech, and I asked the chief medical practitioner if Lee could get a cochlear implant. And for 2 years, I asked and I asked and I asked, and they kept putting off and making excuses and saying they would do it, and they didn't. Finally, and I did know that success in attaining speech was very much dependent on the earlier they are implanted, the greater the success. So by this time, Lee was 5 years old, and I thought, if he doesn't get this now, it's not going to benefit him. So I found a loophole and I went through my GP. At the same time, I felt it was only the decent thing to do to contact the chief medical practitioner, or medical officer, I think her name was, and just to say to her, oh, by the way, since I haven't heard from you, you haven't referred them, I've gone through my GP just to let you know this is what I've done. She said she was sent a letter backing this, and I received a copy of that letter, and it was hugely detrimental to us as a family, making out we were a troublemaker family when we weren't. I'd been compliant up to this point, everything apart from teaching my son sign language. I was quite upset about this because I thought that this was going to boycott this operation. However, Crosshouse agreed that they would implant Lee, and during a consultation meeting prior to the operation, I asked the consultant, I said, would you have implanted Lee 2 years prior when I first asked? He says, yes, he most definitely would, because he fitted all the criteria. This came as a complete shock. 2 years I had been asking for this, and it was another 2 years lost helping Lee to be able to attain speech.
Come on then. Oh.
For Lee's 5th year birthday, he received a cochlear implant, and it was hugely successful. Also around this time, a bit later on, I discovered that Edinburgh were trying to boycott Crosshouse Hospital, who did all of the cochlear implantees in Scotland. And I also discovered that much of East Coast of Scotland were actually referring potential implantees to Nottingham rather than Crosshouse, because they were trying to set up their own service. And the other thing was they were cherry picking the children, selecting children who were meningitis, who had hearing in the first instance and then became deaf. So they had more chance of learning speech. So basically, it wasn't a case of implanting. So the success of a cochlear implant was more a case of acquiring speech, regardless of giving children who maybe would find it more difficult to acquire speech, but it was giving them hearing. So they were denying them hearing for the sake of speech. So they were only choosing the children who they thought as proof that this was successful. Oh, look, they're speaking. And that's why Lee was part of this political movement of Edinburgh trying to take the paediatric service off of Crosshouse and Kilmarnock. And that's why Lee never received a cochlear implant during these 2 years, because he was late diagnosed as a fault of the health services, not as a fault of Lee and not as a fault of me. So he was expendable. Lee then attended Glencairn Primary School in Motherwell. At that time, they had a brilliant support system for cochlear implanted children and other deaf children. They had a separate classroom in each year for 3 deaf children and 6 hearing children, with a teacher of deaf and a teacher. This was a great system and the deaf children did very well in it. And also, so did the hearing. However, the head changed and a new head came in and changed the whole ratio, and the whole ethos of the school changed as well. The money that was spent ring-fenced for these deaf children, that was then spent on the whole school rather than supporting the deaf children. By the time Lee was 9.5, I had serious concerns about his ability. He was getting A's and B's, he had great school reports, but I said what he was reading, he didn't understand. What he was writing was merely copying what he was seeing in front of him. He couldn't write a story. He hardly had any spoken language, and he didn't have great sign language because he wasn't really in a signing environment. I thought, quite frankly, I was going mad. They all completely disagreed with me. Everybody was disagreeing with me. And I thought, why can't I believe them? So I thought, right, I'll get him individually, independently assessed in London, which I did. And what came back from that was that he had severe verbal dyspraxia. The senior speech therapist told me at Glencairn that verbal dyspraxia doesn't exist. And that he didn't have a speech and language disorder. And the staff disputed the fact. They said he could read and I knew he couldn't. So anyway, we decided to take him out of Glencairn and put him back into Donaldson School for the Deaf, which was run by a new head teacher. And they were tailoring the communication support. They also run a verbal dyspraxia programme. Some speech therapists say it didn't exist, and here was Donaldson's running a speech and language programme for verbal dyspraxia. I mean, it was just crazy. But we decided then that was the best place for Lee. I think one of the things that parents always worry about when they give birth to disabled children is that they would think, did I do something wrong? For instance, with Lee being deaf, I thought, is it because I played really heavy rock music when I was pregnant with him? Was the music too loud when he was an infant? And different things like that. So I definitely snapped up the chance to take genetic counselling to find out why was Lee deaf. And it transpires anyway that 90% of deaf children are born to hearing parents. So that was one thing to explain, but we also discovered that it was Waardenburg syndrome, which skips generations, and it's just some random genetic DNA that just pops up here and there. Yeah, and because of this huge search, so that set me on a search to find out, well, who was deaf in the past? During this process, I decided to paint. I painted actually several paintings and a sculpture, all to do with genetics. And this particular painting, I almost think it as if it's layers of going through layers of generation, trying to find these missing people who were deaf. And in this painting, I wanted to show layers as if it's layers of time, and these hidden little faces in there are people who happen to be deaf that ran through our family in the past.